Today we're going to discuss communism and why past experiments in communism tell us less than we would assume. Communism has been popular in underground radical groups and universities since its inception as an idea. The simple maxim of from each according to his ability, for each according to his needs, rings true to many people. Also, the idea of a utopic society of cooperation where no one is left behind calls out to our compassion. But for some reason, each attempt at rigid communism with no trace of capitalism has seemed to fail. But how much do these failures teach us? In science, it is widely accepted that when each iteration of an experiment yields similar results, we are permitted to start considering these results as containing some element of truth. And, of course, one always leaves open the opportunity for new data to change one's mind. But what if the experiment is always doomed to fail until it isn't? From my limited investigations into communism through literature, discussion, and university classes, there's one problem I rarely see addressed. In ideal communism, the individual should want for nothing, as the state will provide for them. For the individual to want for nothing, there are certain types of labor that must be accomplished. Many of these types of labor are unattractive to most citizens. Imagine sanitation work, dangerous construction jobs, menial labor, and any job that doesn't appeal to most people. In a communist society, these jobs, this labor, must still be accomplished. So how do most communist societies choose to do this? Either through forced labor or through the elimination of those luxuries or things that a citizen requires. Forced labor brews resentment within the population. A resentful population calls for reform, and these calls for reform were normally met with a tightening of totalitarian control. A resentful population also becomes less productive, which in turn requires more forced labor, which in turn begets more resentment, ad infinitum. If the controlling Communist Party decides instead to eliminate those things that a citizen has grown accustomed to, then more resentment is created, especially if the population knows that those luxuries that they require or desire are attainable in other forms of government. Think of a North Korean citizen accustomed to strict rations on electricity, if any electricity at all, who gets to spend a day in China, where electricity comes cheap. That citizen will compare the luxuries of their home country with the most basic expected living conditions in China and see a gulf in difference. This resentment that is inspired within the citizen again erodes the trust in the communist system. Now, forced labor is not unique to communist systems. Slavery was the norm in virtually every society that has ever existed. It's a fairly sophomoric observation to realize that even in capitalist societies, there is unattractive labor that individuals are either coerced into or just simply left no other options. Think of the multitude of undocumented immigrants in America that work soul-crushing hours in unsafe or demeaning conditions. These workers are often denied safety equipment or basic perks like paid sick and maternity leave or dental insurance. These workers must accept these jobs because if they do not, someone else surely will. The only clear difference between forced labor in a capitalist society and in a communist one is the illusion of choice and the promise of a better life, if not for themselves, then for their children. This seems to be enough to keep the resentment in a capitalist society at acceptable levels. Now, back to our idea of experiments. Clearly, past experiments in rigid communism have ended in failure, and that would lead us to believe that communism as an idea is bunk. But what if a further requirement for true communism to take place is that of the elimination of unattractive labor? What if the only way a communist society would function is if every menial job was automated? Then there would be no need for forced labor, nor the elimination of luxuries. But if this were the case, then any attempt at communism before this total automation would be doomed for failure. We would have a situation in which our interpretation of all of our experiments would lead us to believe that communism would never work, when in fact, the only truth we can actually gain from those experiments is, each time we've tried communism, it's been too early. I feel I must conclude this by admitting that I do not currently champion for communism, nor am I convinced that future societies will necessarily become communist. I see this mainly as an example of how our interpretations of experiments can be misguided, and we must keep in mind that an experiment can only support or not support a hypothesis, rather than completely prove or disprove a truth. This universe is one of change. There's no guarantee that the variables today will be the variables of tomorrow.